First of all, Morena, good morning, and tēnā koutou, kina tō koutou katoa. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to actually see so many of you keen and interested in hearing what we bring from the team I'm working with, and also excited to see all the people on Zoom linking in. So I hope, no pressure here, that I can deliver what you are hoping to receive today, making time out of your busy work days. Before I go a bit further, my purpose for coming here was effectively what Bridget, you said, is giving you as the people in the background of providing data some feel and sense of what we're doing with the data and what specific aspects came out of it. So we found that when talking to assessors or different people in Canterbury or South Canterbury District Health Board, they really value to see what happens out of their work when they go through the assessments and ticking boxes and entering into the computer. So, and I'm not quite sure what backgrounds you all have, so some of it may be relevant for you, some of it may not be, so just bear with me. So that was said, I've joined the team I'm with at the moment about 18 months ago in Christchurch. It's led by Dr. Hamish Jamieson, a geriatrician. And the presentation I give is a journey through about 5-6 pieces of research that all lead to an interventional trial that we're doing at the moment. And some of the research I've not even been involved, like this one. This was done before I actually came on board, but still, it's interesting. So what I'm going to talk about is drug burden and falls. How did we link that together? A follow-up of that was, how did we link drug burden index or polypharmacy to hip fractures? What we're doing at the moment is developing, or have done, is a New Zealand validated frailty index out of interRAI data. Then right now we're in the startup phase of an interventional trial to reduce polypharmacy. And it's a bit of a side research we've done into some social factors that lead people that we see to go into aged care. I've got one other piece which I don't know whether I can bring up in terms of time. What I thought doing in terms of questions, there may be after each one of those individual research pieces a bit of time to ask some questions, but at the end we'll have more time. So each one of the research pieces has these standard aspects. In the presentation they are not necessarily in sequence, but they're all covered. So most of you know that. It was a slide I put in for a presentation in Calgary earlier in the year. So right now, what we think we're getting is about 30,000 assessments per year that's being added to the database. You probably have more information than I do. And our unique position in New Zealand, as far as I understand, is we can link a lot of other data to the interRAI assessment. And it's globally, in a way, unique, and you will see a bit more about that going forward. So this first piece of research was about seeing how the exposure to two specific medication classes lead to falls in older people in their homes. And the way we approached it, we have the interRAI home care data set, and from Pharmac, the dispensing information about drugs. We could link that, and at the time of the research we had about 75,586 records that we could draw on. This is a huge data set. The drug burden, for the ones of you who don't know, is a measure that was developed by Sarah Hilmer in Sydney. It's a mathematical equation that can be applied to give an indication of how much side effects people may experience when taking these drugs. It follows the pharmaceutical sinusoidal curve in a way. So What we then done, we said, rather than look at one medication, look at the total drug intake people have. 3, 4, 5, 6 different pills they take, and looked at a 90-day interval just prior to their interRAI assessment. So what did they take in the 90 days before they had the assessment? And grouped that into 4 different brackets based on their cumulative drug burden. Was it 0, means that it take nothing, or was it up to 1, between 1 and 3, or more than 3, which is, as you can see, it's rather rare. A lot of people, 27,000, were on no drugs of that specific class. About 21,000 were on up to 1 in DBI, and then it tapers off. It's a very skewed distribution, and some of those very high up, like 6, are possibly people who experiment and test out drugs. So they have in their prescription 5, let's say, antidepressants, which they trialed in that period, and we can't quite see that. So this is just descriptive statistics, what we could see, and in general, what we can see is that the higher the drug burden, the cumulative is, the less favorable the conditions are. People have, lesser people have no falls with more drug burden, or have higher, percentage-wise, higher falls, 1 or 2 or more. So the numbers, is there a pointer? So the percentage figure goes up for 2 or more falls, depending on where they sit in their class. So that to us showed actually there's a real link between the number of anticholinergic and sedative drugs they take and how many falls they experience. Statistically, it was done with a regression model, and the unique part, and this is where the uniqueness with the New Zealand data set came in, rather than just looking at pills, we could control for things from age, the age group, sex, ethnicity, cognitive performance. There's a lot of things we could statistically control for to really narrow in and say, because of all these controlling factors, we know this part, this contribution is the drug burden part. It's not a part of, let's say, age or a part of body mass index. It's statistically accounted for. So again, when we then did what's called an odd ratios statistic, what you can see is if we don't take into account all these other factors, that's what it would look like. But interesting enough, if we take into account all these other confounders, we can say that the odd ratio is 0.41 higher if you're on on that drug level than it is if you're on no drugs. So very clear correlation there, very clear output. So conclusions, it's independently a risk for falls, the drug burden index, and we could develop the DBI as a assessment tool for clinicians, up to a point that we could possibly electronically even show it when they have their GP visit. It comes up and say, you're on a DBI of X or Y, or what is it? So the GP could be alerted to. So this was the first piece in the journey around drug burden. So what we then did is that let's look at some of the outcomes of falls, which is hip fractures. Older people are very vulnerable, and the outcome of fracturing a hip is very unfavorable. Let's put it mildly. So very similar approach, but it was a very different take. You will see in a moment. We had, for this research, we had not just the interRAI home care data set and the dispensing data, we also linked into fractures from hospital records and mortality. And this time we had 72,000 and a few more assessments. And then I put it in once so you see how it works. We start with a data set, exclude what just doesn't quite make sense or has certain, like in this instance, 330 people didn't consent. We had some invalid encrypted NHIs in it in the data set, and we had nearly 1,000 data sets outside the study period. We just excluded them. Then we ended up with 70,500, and at the end of the study period there were 48,000 people still alive, had no fracture. 2,250 had one fracture, which actually is a lot. It's 3%, more than 3% of the people experienced a fracture. And 20,000 died at the end of the study period. This is what we used. I just put it up to get some pictures in there to make it a bit more interesting. And use the ICD-10 codes for it. Again, you've seen that slide before. Use the same approach. However, here we did something different. We said, rather than just look at the drug intake 90 days prior to the assessment, we looked at the drug intake for about up to 5 years in 90-day intervals. So we did effectively a time-based assessment. How long were people on what burden? It was a huge data set, and otherwise it's the same criteria. So the output, and I don't want to overwhelm you with that, so this is just a summary slide of what came out of it. It doesn't actually tell us a hell of a lot. It tells us that, as you would expect, if people get older, fewer are alive, more have a fracture, and more die. Fairly straightforward, isn't it? It tells you, when you look at sex, that women tend to stay alive, men tend to die. For whatever reason. So a similar picture to before. The distribution doesn't change, even if you look at it over time. But this is where it gets different. We have the baseline, which is 90 days before people have their interRAI, and then the number of people in 90-day intervals and the median drug burden. So what is the median, for the ones who statistically, it's the point when you have an equal amount of participants on one side and then the other side, rather than the average, which tells us just an arithmetic average. And what we could see is over time it just very slightly goes up. There's not a lot of change in terms of the drug intake for people. It just slightly goes up, which is just because the sample size goes down, but there's not much in it. So we then did what's called a competing risk regression analysis. This is a method that looks at outcomes but takes mortality into account. It says effectively the survival case is you're alive and you have no fracture during the study period. The hazard is you have a fracture, and the competing hazard is you die. It's a very suitable technique if you have changes in your population, for example due to mortality over the study period, which is in the elderly a very natural thing to happen. And again, we had an enormous amount of controlling confounders, potential ones that we could take into the analysis. Okay, just right through the end result. Again, same slide, you see the 4 groups and the number of people who were alive at the end, depending on group size, the ones who had a fracture and the ones who died. And if you would just look at this block of numbers, there isn't actually a lot of novel information in it. It's even a bit tricky to interpret. However, if we do take the competing risk analysis, you get a clear indication of the risk factor of the drugs. And then if we, which is the adjusted number, if we take all of those different aspects into account, from demographics to lifestyle to illnesses to what you could see as potential results for fractures, if we take this into account, we see that the higher the people are on their drug load, the higher the risk is simply due to drug load on them fracturing a hip. So if you're on a DBI of 0, which is for us the reference point, the risk is 1. If you're on a drug load between 0 and 1, it's a 12% increase in risk. If you're on 1 to 3, it's a 33% risk. On above 3, it's a 52% increase in risk that you have a fracture in your hip. And knowing out of the data that about a third of the people who have a hip fracture die within a year, it is a significant impact.
Sorry, can I ask a question on that one?
Yes. Go ahead.
The way it's looking here, you've got the fracture column where the percentage of the patients in each group look like they're almost identical.
Yes.
The death, the ones who died, looks like it increases.
Yep.
You're saying the hazard ratio is against the likelihood of having had a fracture.
Due to the drug burden only. This is the difference between looking at the raw data in a normal descriptive way, like in that block, and competing risk analysis with all of those confounders controlled for. This is why it's suddenly... Sorry?
What were the reasons the other people had fractures?
That we didn't look into it, but some may have in some instances it may be better explained, statistically better explained, that they, for example, have a wandering status, like they would wander around and therefore have some form of movement that is at times risky. That may be a reason for them. But if we take that into account, or seasonality, like what happens in winter or summer, supplements and all of those other things, this is what's left statistically as the risk purely due to drugs. It is a bit tricky to get one's head around it, but that's where the competing risk assessment becomes so powerful. It just suddenly stands out what this one factor contributes to the picture.
Yeah, I don't think you can still say purely due to drugs, because although you're controlling for a lot of confounders, there's still going to be some things that you won't have got there. I don't know if orthostatic hypertension was in the...
Yeah, there may be some aspects in it where, I mean, there's limits to statistics, but there may also be aspects that we have no measure for that contribute to it. But the beauty of that research particularly was that we could show that it's not, let's say the BMI is not the cause, or it's not explained, the 50% is not explained through BMI or cognitive or wandering or whatever. It is, the essence is the drug burden. So there's a second part to it. As I said, we looked at the time sequence as well as a journey. We could also show that there's a dose-response relationship. So the longer people are on a drug, I'll just go for the adjusted model again, the longer they are on a drug, the more expressed that risk becomes. So we effectively shown two things. We said the DBI in itself is a risk for hip fractures, and it is a risk in terms of the level people are on, but also in terms of the duration, how long they're taking it. And with that, deep prescribing as an intervention really stood out as something to look out for and check. And I just want to mention a few people, acknowledgements in that sense. Hamish, my boss, is really driving force in getting results out of big data. And one person in particular, Professor Abernethy from the FDA in the US, was a big advocate of the work that Hamish's team is doing. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, so it's a reason to acknowledge him specifically. And I want to acknowledge at this point the team here who give us the data in whatever you do to get us the data that we can work with, whatever your part is. Thank you for that.
So, have you considered other types of drugs? I mean, basically this drug group is only using 2 types of drugs. So,
for this reason, so the question was, did we consider other drugs? The reason we picked, and I forgot to mention it, picked sedatives and anticholinergics is the anticholinergics, me not being a medical professional, but I've been told they have, amongst the drug classes, the most dominant side effects and most unhelpful side effects. And the sedatives make dizzy. So these 2 drug classes have side effects that lead people to unsteadiness, to dizziness, to a risk of falls. And in an aged environment with old people, they don't necessarily produce what we want them to produce. And for a number of reasons, have the tendency to just grow the collection of drugs of that nature people tend to grow just because of what they're used for. There are the
maybe hypertensives, for example.
No, we didn't take them into account, but there are DBI measures, as far as I understand, they could be used for those drug classes, so it could be extended. So I had the privilege of presenting this specific piece of research in Calgary early in the year, and because it's such a novel piece of how we tied information together, how we used it, and what the outcome was, we got presented this innovation award, which in a way I collected. I haven't even been part of this research, I just collected it. And it's an acknowledgement to the team who's done the research, but I actually want to go further than this. This is an acknowledgement also to you guys who provide data in terms of doing assessments, for you doing database maintenance, taking care we can record it, making sure we can have the data, and then it goes further to the people who actually had the vision in New Zealand to put this in place, because it puts New Zealand in a unique position that even big countries like Canada are just now starting to replicate in some parts. So this goes to everyone involved in my line of thinking. The current research we're doing, I said we have a follow-up study. We're looking into ways of identifying people who would benefit from deprescribing those specific drugs. And one component is to build what's called a frailty index, a number that indicates how vulnerable people are, how limited they are. Rebecca Abbe Nesbitt it's in part is her work, and it links to her own PhD work at the moment in terms of creating a hip fracture risk score. We actually we have now a model that uses what's called a cumulative deficit model. It picks individual elements of the interRAI and just counts how many there are. But there are a number of aspects, like from cognitive performance to decision making to walking speed. There are aspects where we say, actually, is this a risk that would represent frailty or not? And we've followed a model that is globally pretty much established. And it says if there are 51 deficits that we have identified across 49 interRAI variables, and they get a deficit between 0 and 1 in increments, and then you just add them up and divide them by the number of variables. So it becomes a number between 0 and 1. Then we looked into how does this relate to known measures as a measure of validity. And some of the results is, again, descriptive. The one that makes that whole thing visually is this picture, and I like visuals, they're easier to understand. So this is an assessment that looks at survival, so the rate of survival over time, which means everyone is alive at time 0, and then people die, and the way the curves look tell you, are they frailty group 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 or 5. And we group them based on criteria. And it clearly shows that the mortality rate, especially in the first 500 days, the decline is rapid. So that frailty index correlates and represents mortality in a very good way, and it discerns between different levels of frailty. So we're pretty confident that this measure is useful, and at the moment we're preparing some publications for that. The second part of that study that we're doing is we want to use the frailty index to help clinicians or help medical practitioners to say, you're on a frailty index of XYZ, whatever your number is, and you're on certain drugs. Therefore, does it make sense for you to get a deprescribing intervention? That helps primarily to make a most cost-effective and targeted intervention to people who most benefit from it. It is done as a randomized control trial funded by the HRC. We're currently running or completing the pilot in Timaru, which gives us the indication of is what we set up as research actually working. And we are about to start in Timaru and Christchurch with a full-blown RCT. It will take us to about mid-2020. So this is about
Sorry,
where...
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes?
The pharmacist prescribing, what's the model that you're adopting to involve the pharmacist? Is that are you trialling a new model of pharmacy service, or are you utilising something that currently exists?
We're using a model that in some shape or form exists, but we're narrowing it down to our target medicine. So if the person is meeting certain criteria, the pharmacist will visit the person at home, do a medication reconciliation, get understanding of the conditions, and then use their pharmaceutical expertise to provide additional information to the patient's GP. The GP will then make a clinical call and say, is this appropriate? Do I want to take it into account, or no, I don't agree with what's being put forward? So it's intended to be an additional piece of information, just like a GP would order an X-ray or a lab result, but the control stays with the GP.
Yeah, sorry, when I said something that it exists already, as in within the region that you're trialling it in Timaru, you mentioned,
yeah.
is that type of service, it sounds like an MTA, is that a funded service that people are already doing, or are you sponsoring it in a way of there is a specific pharmacist that will be doing this that is funded through the research project?
Well, the latter. I mean, there are MTA services are available, but they're not necessarily widely used. And we're funding the pharmacists through our research fund and see what their much narrower approach to medication review may bring.
Yeah, okay. I guess the only concern around that, and you've probably considered it through the research group already, I'm sure it's already been thought about, but the concern would be when you get from a really highly controlled trial to translating into something that can apply in practice across a wide variety of people as to how that actually translates and whether it comes from research into practice.
Yes.
If you do get good outcomes.
Yes, that's definitely a challenge. There are a number of challenges in this research, but that's definitely one we identified. What's the uptake, and is it easily transferable? But it's set up as a transferable project. Okay.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Okay, Jack, I have a question for Bridget.
Go for it.
Is there any look at that frailty score becoming an outcome?
Well, actually, glad you asked that, Susan. So the question was, what will happen to this frailty score?
Yeah.
I was already thinking of the clinical relevance and hoping that
Sorry.
the world could be aligned so that when you complete your interRAI assessment, that frailty index is auto-generated in our software and reports available. That would be ideal, wouldn't it? And it's entirely possible the way we have our software enhancement process. So it's just hurry up and finish.
Yep. Yeah.
And then we can take it through the next steps. But that's absolute clinical value from your research, isn't it?
And I think it would be seen by a much wider population as being relevant than some of the people who now look and think it doesn't tell me anything because they don't know what they're looking at. If they could see, GPs could all see a frailty score, ED could see a frailty score, it would be so exciting and being able to...
And what I like about it is there's no extra effort from the assessor or the older person. You're doing the assessment anyway. Wouldn't it be great then to just use that experience for yet another value?
Yeah. We had a second part in that frailty score development. We had a number of focus groups that looked into what do older people perceive frailty to be, which is, I don't have the presentation for it, but the interesting part for me was the perception among Europeans, white Europeans, is fairly consistent with our deficit view, our Western European style deficit view. If you're frail, something is missing. When we had a focus group that looked at Maori, very, very different perception. It's like quite a different take on even that term. They didn't like it, because there's much, much higher appreciation of the contribution of older people to their way of living, their society, what they bring. So part of the translation into clinical practice is to account for the perception, and that's a piece that is yet to be worked through.
It's great that you had a lot of variables in your... Oh, by the way, you might need to repeat the question at the end.
Yeah.
You had a lot of variables in your study that you were able to adjust for so that you could really calculate the odds ratios. But of course the interRAI data won't have all the variables about people. I know it collects a lot, there are often hidden variables.
Yeah.
Have you considered an approach that might be more robust against hidden variables such as propensity score matching?
Yeah, so the question to repeat to the rest is, we've got a lot of variables, confounders out of the interRAI, but there are others that are not in there, whether we can use things like propensity score matching. It's the limit of my knowledge I've know about propensity score matching. My understanding is we would need to use interRAI data within the pool of participants to create a propensity score so we can identify similar people. In order to get other confounders into the data set, we would need to find a way to linking them. So right now they're all linked with encrypted NHIs. So if we would have other confounders that are not part of the interRAI, let's say socioeconomic factor, as long as we can bring them in through that linking NHI or something similar, then we can bring them in. But at the moment, I don't think all of them are available.
We're looking at developing that capability, so we might be able to
add
going forward as another
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
I can see you getting excited.
Yeah. It's amazing what we can do with big data. It also has a number of significant challenges that you don't have in small group research.
Oh, hi, it's Robin here, educator with interRAI. I do have a question, and it reflects back on the first slide. You had mentioned that you reflect back on 90 days for the drugs or medication taken. The interRAI assessment reflects back on medication taken over previous 3 days. So I'm assuming that the 90-day period was taken from Pharmac for the purpose of that data. Is that the case, or has it been captured as to when perhaps the medication has been started in direct relation to a falls risk? Is that defined at any point? Just curious to know about the interRAI data being used there.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Question was how do we work that 90-day? What was the data set? So the data we used were purely Pharmac dispensing data, and they were linked from 90 days prior to the date of assessment, based on what came into these 90 days as a dispensed medication. The interRAI medication information is one of the ones we're not quite sure how reliable it is, because there are so many different aspects in terms of daily practice that could impact the robustness of that. Does it answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Because if there are no other questions, I have one other piece I would love to present as an experiment, if you're willing to follow me. How many people, and you on Zoom can do the same thing, if you answer yes to one of those questions, just raise your hand and keep it raised. How many of you in your circle of friends or family know of any child or youth who's got some form of developmental challenge, whether they have a mobility issue or a learning difficulty? How many of you? Just keep your hand up. So how many of you know someone somewhere who's got a family setting that is challenging? Poverty, family violence, divorce, abuse. How many of you know of someone somewhere who's got some behavioral issues, whether it's bullying, themselves bullying, or being at the receiving end of bullying, or antisocial behavior? You can go further. How many of you know someone who actually has criminal tendencies as a result of that? So we could go on, and my guess is, just looking around, by the end of those questions, pretty much every one of you would have your hands up. I find it a difficult thing to take, actually. This is our New Zealand reality. So when in Canada, researchers stood up and presented an interRAI child use and suite of assessments, I was just taken by it, and I said, I want as many people as possible to know about that set of tools. And we can I don't know much about it other than it touches on all of those points. If you just briefly go through some of the slides. So statistics out of Ontario: 1 in 5 students experience mental health issues. 25% of those with mental health issues actually get the treatment they need. What a group of researchers have done in the interRAI group is they developed a whole suite of different tools that follow people from babies from being born into their adolescence, with different elements. It's all integrated, so people you can follow their journey, their life journey, branch out into specific assessments for specific needs. It has, there's these different groupings and different instruments. Some are in pilot, some are already being used. And they have these action plans behind it with different aspects where care could be given, where indicators could be given, what's needed. And it then feeds into home care, into school environment, mental health services, developmental services, emergency triaging. What do you do with a suicidal youth? And it goes through their life, and has screening tools, it has clinical deep assessment tools, all sorts of different instruments that could help us in New Zealand, I believe, to actually get a handle on what's going on in this country. I could infer and repeat a lot what's on those pages. I just hope that somewhere, someone I can reach who knows where to go for with this one. So we start in New Zealand a discussion. Could that help us getting somewhere with our significant issues around children and youth? So that's a plea for promotion and lobbying in a way of that aspect. And I'm sure we could get some experts from in this domain to New Zealand to actually reach people at the Ministry of Health or Social Development. I don't even know where it would need to be placed. It's not my domain. It's just something I came across and just see, it just rings when I see both the New Zealand part and what's on offer. So that's all I wanted to bring up. Thank you. Thank you for joining and listening, and I hope you got something out of it.